everybody, this is International Master Jesse Cry, and today we are going to begin a series talking about the difficult and touchy topic of two minors versus a rook. When is this a good exchange, and when is it not? This will be a lecture series in more than one part, and in today's series, I'm going to look at typical positions from the opening phase of the game, where we get two pieces for a rook. Okay, let's just begin right off with a standard position that I'm sure many of you have had in your own games. E4, E5, F3, knight C6, bishop C4, bishop C5. And here, of course, white has many opportunities, but let's just say white plays the natural knight C3, knight F6. Now, the question would be is there anything wrong with knight G5, attacking F7? So, let's take a look. Knight G5, and black's natural move here would be to play castles, defending the F7 pawn and developing at the same time. You might recognize that actually there's a lot of different variations and ways in which this can come up. You can just imagine the pieces placed a little bit differently and see that this is a kind of position which can happen in many different ways for the king-pawn openings. And so white has a chance here to get two pieces for the rook. And in a way, he's already committed himself to that plan by playing knight G5. Let's ask ourselves, would this be a good trade? Knight takes F7. Now, the answer is that it's actually horrible. But why? Why is this such a bad trade? I mean, white has essentially 6 points, 3 for the bishop and 3 for the knight, and he's getting a rook and a pawn. And this following position would result. In fact, it kind of looks like he's gotten something more than that. It looks like he's gotten the king, the black king, out a little bit, and it seems like he's doing fine. But in fact, this was a horrible mistake. Okay? And I think there's two main reasons for this. So, I think in order to understand the first reason, we have to tell Nimzovich's tale, one of my favorite tales. What we have to do is we have to imagine for a moment that we're a farmer. Okay? We're a farmer. And we have this beautiful pig. This pig looks like it's going to fetch a lot at the market. Now, for whatever reason, the pig dies. Maybe it was stolen, maybe it died through illness. In any case, it's gone. And the farmer begins to mourn for the pig. Now, why does the farmer mourn for the pig? Now, clearly, the farmer is mourning because he lost the material of the pig, right, that he could sell. But the kind of little bit more subtle point is the farmer is mourning the fact that he invested a lot of resources on this pig. He invested time, his own time, in caring for the pig. He invested money in the food for the pig and for the space for the pig and putting up the pig pen. All these things he invested in the pig. Now, what does this have to do with our current position? Let's go back. In this position, the way to think about this is that our pig, really, is our knight and our bishop. So that's what we're materially giving away. However, what's happening is that it's not just that we're giving away the bishop and the knight. Right? A lot of beginners see this position and say, well, I'm giving up a bishop and knight for a rook and a pawn. But in fact, what white is also giving away is he's giving away 3 tempo that he has, or tempi, which he has invested in these two pieces. The knight is moved twice, and the bishop once. And this is very important to understand. You're giving away 3 tempi in this exchange, the 3 tempi which you've invested into the bishop and the knight. And that's like for the farmer, that is the money he spent on the food, on the pig pen, his own time. All of those things are like the tempi in this position. Okay, that's one reason that it's a bad move. But why else? And this has come closer to the heart of what we're going to be discussing today, the nature of this trade. I think that the first thing we can see is that the bishop on c4 and the knight on g5, whether it was on knight on g5 or f3, are fairly active pieces. They're doing things. Let's compare that to the rook on f8. At the moment, it really is not doing a whole lot. And so, essentially, by taking on f7, we're developing that rook, right? We're getting it out of there. So this piece that's fairly useless at the moment, all of a sudden, attains a use by giving itself away. And this is a very important thing to think about with the rook versus the bishop and knight. Because in the opening phase of the game, the bishop and the knight are going to be stronger than the rook. Because in the opening phase of the game, they can do more things, whereas the rook has to wait until the position opens before he can express all of his power. Okay? So that's the first thing I think we've learned, is that we need to be a little bit careful in the opening about giving away 2 minors for rook, just because at the end of this position, what we'll find in the next coming phase of this game, if we were to play it out, that all of black's minors are going to be powerful. For example, black is going to play d6, this bishop will easily come out, the queen can move, and then the rook can find its way to the f8 square. All of the pieces are going to be able to find useful roles, whereas white's 2 rooks will only become powerful if the game opens up later. But we can see that this is not going to happen for a long time. So it's almost as if black is playing up material at the moment, because those 2 rooks are not going to be a force in the game in the foreseeable future. And this is a key feature of the exchange bishop and knight for a rook in the opening, because now the black's minor pieces will be much stronger. So I think because this is something that is gained, this is a knowledge that's gained on the basis of experience of different positions, let's look at a different position and see if we can recognize some of the same traits. Let's look at a position that's common in the Sicilian Sozin, or the Fischer variation. Okay, all standard stuff. And again, this variation that I'm going to show can be reached, or the idea can be reached by a lot of different move orders. Okay. Now, the question in this kind of thematic position is, should white play bishop takes pawn, after which pawn takes bishop, knight takes bishop, the queen on d8 will have to move, and white gets the rook. So in this case, instead of just getting 1 pawn for the rook, white gets 2. What do our listeners think? Is this a good exchange for white, or is this a bad idea? And how should we judge the resulting position? Let's take a look. Bishop takes pawn, pawn takes, knight takes, let's say queen c8. I'm sure there's other possible moves for the queen. It takes, bishop takes. Okay. In fact, this was a very poor decision by white. And it's kind of hard to understand, right? Because instead of being an equal exchange in terms of material, this time it looks like white has positively won material. He has won 2 pawns instead of 1, like in the last example. And in this example, it even looks like his rooks are a little bit closer to coming out. And indeed, I think it's true that maybe this is a little bit better for white than in the last example. But nevertheless, white's in grave danger here. Because, again, black's minor pieces will be much stronger than white's pieces in the coming phase of the game. And it's in that phase of the game where we shouldn't be surprised if white drops a pawn or gets saddled with some kind of serious weakness. And we can see even in the present instance that because white has lost his minor pieces, this pawn on e4 can become a real target for white, for black. Okay, Let's back up just a second again and look at the other reason why this might be wrong, this bishop takes pawn on e6. Let's think about this. Well, it seems like we have an analogous situation as the last example here again, because this rook on f8 isn't doing anything, and the move he's invested in the rook helped also the black king, whereas white really invested a whole lot of time and energy into his big. Right? He invested 2 moves into the bishop, where he moved bishop c4, and then bishop b3, and then 2 moves on the knight, knight f3, and then pawn takes, knight takes d4. So that's basically 4 tempi that are going into this pig in the exchange of the 2 pieces versus the rook. So again, in this opening phase of the game, it's very common that when you give the 2 pieces away for the rook wasn't doing anything, whereas the 2 pieces really were. They were doing a great deal, and you invested a lot of time and energy and resources into them before the exchange happened. And that's a fact that I'm stressing because I think a lot of people don't think about that. Okay, let's look at another position. Again, I think these things are best learned by looking at more than one position. Here's an opening variation which I myself played, and I think I played incorrectly. f5, and I played d3. As you might have guessed from my other opening lectures, I'm of the opinion that it's not necessarily the best moves that are the good openings, but the ones that set black the most problems. And that was also the case here. My opponent played knight f6. I played e4. And I think my opponent played the best move here, d6. If he were to take the pawn, I think white gets more than enough compensation with a move like bishop d3. All of my pieces are coming out, and I'll have big threats with moves like knight g5. Okay. So, e4, d6, and in my opening preparation here, I thought that after e5, white might have a slight edge. And maybe he does, but it was far less simple than I had thought. So pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Knight d7 has to be correct. You have to be able to fight for the square on e5. If I'm able to hold the square on e5, it has to be good for me. So I played bishop f4, just trying to hold that square. In particular, I think it's important to see if I hold the square, he won't be able to play e5, and this bishop on c8 is unfortunately placed because of the pawn on f5. So white has a strategical idea, and black really has to find a way to break that. Now in the game that I played here, my opponent played a poor move, knight takes knight, and after bishop takes knight, I think white just has a very dominant position, particularly because he's controlling the square e5. However, I think maybe he should have considered knight d5. So, after knight d5, I was contemplating queen h5. And so this is maybe a good chance for an evaluation exercise. So an evaluation exercise is one where we look a few moves in advance and then try to determine what we think of that position. So my opponent didn't play knight d5 because of queen h5. So I'll try to go slow. Knight d5, queen h5, g6, and now white has knight takes g6. Looks very convincing. However, black then has knight 7 to f6, queen h4, my queen has to move, pawn takes knight on g6, queen takes rook on h8, knight takes f4. Try to visualize that position. If you need to, hit the pause button. What do you think of that position? Who's better, white or black, or is it unclear? So, I think the answer is that black should have played knight d5, and I think I would have been in serious trouble after knight d5. And one of the things that I think the last two examples should show us is that in the opening phase of the game, you should be real hesitant to give up your two minor pieces for a rook. And let's look at how that position would have developed. queen h5, g6, knight takes, knight f6, queen h4, pawn takes, queen takes, knight takes f4. Okay, let's try to take stock of this position. Now, my opponent told me after the game that he didn't like this position because it felt unclear to him. And you can imagine, it looks kind of unclear, that the queen looks like it's penetrated into the black camp. White doesn't look like he has any severe weaknesses. But in fact, if he was aware of what we were discussing in the last two examples, I think he would have gone into this variation without thinking really too much about it. Because here he's done this typical thing. I've got a rook and a pawn for 2 pieces. But which pieces did I give up? I gave up my knight on e5, and I paid 2 tempi for that piece. And I gave up my bishop on f4, for which I paid 1 tempi. So that's the first problem with my decision to go after the rook like this. And then the second problem is that now in the next phase of the game, his minor pieces will be significantly stronger than my 2 bonehead rooks sitting on h1 and a1, which are going to do nothing in the foreseeable future. So in this next phase of the game, black will have very good chances to dominate with his minor pieces. Okay, so what I hope these 3 examples have shown is that in the opening we need to take really good care not to give up 2 pieces for a rook, because at that phase of the game the rooks are not as important as the minor pieces. And that's a very interesting concept, because what we're saying is that at certain phases of the game, the minor pieces have more value than the heavy pieces. And that, to me anyways, is an interesting comment just in itself. Even though on the basis of these examples, it feels kind of obvious, this fact. Okay, and the next thing is just to be aware of the fact that usually when you make this trade with bishop and knight against the rook, you're giving up resources that your pig has consumed in the form of tempi, which you've invested. And that's something, that example with the pig and the farmer and his pig is something that you can use in various phases of opening play, not just with the bishop and knight versus the rook. So, in the continuation of this lecture, which I'm going to do next week, I'll be looking at cases where we'll have to ask ourselves, is the bishop and knight versus the rook a good idea? And that'll become more interesting when the position opens up more, and maybe the rooks have more influence. So, this is International Master Jesse Pry, hoping you've enjoyed this first part in my series on the 2 minors versus the rook. Bye-bye.